In the last video, I talked about I talked about Cyrus the Great focusing on conquering Babylon, and I did mention that before Herodotus tells us about how taking over or conquering Babylon went on, he goes on a tangent to give us some information, and he goes on to tell us about Babylon before the war with Persia. So in this video, I'm still going to focus on that tangent. So Herodotus does go into detail to tell us how people lived in Babylon, the city itself, and the surrounding empire. It tells us about agriculture, the economy of the city, and he explains that most of the economic or the primary economic activity of the people who live in the city was farming. They were doing farming in the surrounding land, and he says, unlike Egypt, where like Egypt, where farming was done completely using irrigation, in Babylon, initially they would have rain, and then they will plant the seeds, and then as they are growing now, they move on to using irrigation water. And he explains that the irrigation is also different from what was happening in Egypt. While in Egypt, the farmers relied on the overflow of the water from River Nile. In Babylon, there was no overflow. What used to happen is the farmers used canals and some form of machines or some mechanical systems that they use to pump the water out of the river onto the land. And he also tells us the kind of crops that the people there grew, and he says mostly it was wheat, barley, and corn or maize. And then he tells us about that there were other tribes nearby, or which were still a part of Babylon, that did fishing. And in fact, he goes into detail to tell us of this one tribe whose only food was fish. They did not eat anything else except fish. They ate fish just as fish flesh. They also dried fish and pound it into flour and made cake out of it, and that's all they ate. He tells us about the commerce, how people from outside the kingdom will use the river, I think River Tigris or Euphrates, to transport goods. And especially talks about wine from the upper parts of the Euphrates and Tigris River, where people are bringing wine to sell to the Babylonians. And he also tells us about some cultural practices. He tells us about marriage, that every year there used to be something like a festival, and girls who had reached the age of marriage will all be brought into a central point, and then they will be sold. An event that was overseen by a priest, I think he mentions. And then during this activity, he will start selling from the most beautiful girls, and then those that are considered not to be very beautiful are sold last, and the most beautiful ones are sold at very high price, and those ones that are not very beautiful are sold at a low price. Then he also explains another cultural practice that is very, like, it's not something that I've heard happens anywhere or in any other period anywhere. Maybe it has. I'm not trying to claim that I know everything. So it talks about something that used to happen in the temple of goddess Mylitta. And goddess Mylitta is Mylitta was the local name of goddess Aphrodite. So Aphrodite, the goddess Aphrodite, the Greeks called her Aphrodite, and the Babylonian called her Mylitta. This is another thing, reading through Herodotus' book, that became very clear to me, that in the ancient world, especially in Asia, Europe, Asia Minor, and Africa, the North Africa, that's Egypt and Libya, all these people kind of had the same gods. Even the Egyptian gods had equivalents of the Greek gods. That I found that to be very interesting. So as he was traveling through the old entire world, that's what he knew as the entire world. Most of the empires and societies kind of worshipped the same gods, but they had different names for these gods. So coming back to goddess Mylitta or Aphrodite, there was a temple in Babylon for her, and Herodotus does talk about other temples for Aphrodite and other gods and goddesses throughout the region and other places. So there was a cultural practice that was unique to Babylon in relation to goddess Aphrodite. And the cultural practice was every woman was expected to sell sex at least once in the temple, and whatever money she collected, that money went as offering to the temple. So women, every day you will go to the temple, not the same women, but those who had not done this at least once in your lifetime as a woman, they will go into the temple and just hang around there, and then men will come. Mostly he calls them strangers. I don't know whether he meant that these were people from outside the city, or he meant that he just called them strangers because these women did not know them. So he says these men will come, and the men will look around, and if they like a particular woman, they will give them the money. And there was no negotiation about how much is to be paid. Whatever that person paid was accepted, and the woman will not say no. And the woman will not say no to anybody. The first person to come to them and drop the coins, they will go and sleep with them within the temple. And that money goes as offering to goddess Aphrodite or Mylitta. And he says that the women from higher society used to have a problem with that. Of course, that's I'm trying to imagine that's not a good experience to go through. And so they used to cover themselves when they come because they don't want to be seen, but the culture expected them to do that at least once in their lifetime. So Herodotus talks about that, and many other. He does in fact talk about how the Babylonian dressed. He describes how their dresses, shoes, and even walking stick. Apparently men used to have a walking stick that used to have a carving maybe of an animal on top of it. That was like common. Yeah. So that's how. If you get to read the book, Herodotus does a very good job of taking you there. You feel like it's like maybe 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years, but it tries to make you feel like you've visited the ancient Babylonian city.